Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. As you may already know, the National Institute of Justice is a component of the Office of Justice Programs and is the research, evaluation, and technology agency of the U.S. Department of Justice. NIJ is dedicated to using science to improve knowledge and understanding of criminal justice issues that affect communities throughout the country. Today's webinar, NIJ FY25, Research and Evaluation of Emerging Technology, Implementation, and Impact for Law Enforcement Purposes NOFO, and Research and Evaluation of Artificial Intelligence for Criminal Justice Purposes NOFO, will be presented by Jill Barnes, Mark Green, and Steve Schutz. They will discuss the NOFOs and answer any questions about the application process. Before getting started, we would like to go through a few housekeeping items. Please note that today's webinar will be recorded. If you are using a computer and need to adjust your audio setting, at the bottom of your screen, click on the down arrow unmute button to adjust as needed. If you are still having an issue, within this icon, you can request that WebEx call your phone directly. You can submit your questions at any time, which will be answered at the end during a Q&A session. To submit your questions, at the bottom right of your screen, click the three dots and select Q&A. Be sure to send your question to all panelists. Closed captioning is available. The closed caption button will be visible in the bottom left corner. Now, let's turn things over to Mark.
Thanks, AJ, and welcome to all of our attendees to this webinar today. Looks like we have a pretty good attendance, and so I'm very delighted to be able to talk about these two notice of funding opportunities that NIJ has published. So today's webinar, AJ covered the welcome. I'm going to give an overview of the NOFO. Jill and Steve are going to talk about the goals and objectives of the two specific NOFOs. And then after they talk about the artificial intelligence and the technology implementation NOFOs, I'm going to come back and talk a little bit about the application submission process, reviewing some of the other things that you'll find within the NOFO document. And then at the end, we'll be doing a Q&A session online. In the meantime, you can type in any questions you have into the Q&A box over on your right, and we can start reviewing those as they come in and hopefully be prepared to answer them. So AJ, if you could just go to the next slide, and I'll give some overviews of the two NOFOs. Typically, when we do webinars for our NOFOs, we do sort of one webinar per NOFO. This one, we combined these two NOFOs into one for this year. One, because they are sort of thematically very similar in many respects in terms of what it is the research questions we're asking. Secondly, we're on a much quicker timeline than we typically are. For those of you who may be familiar with NIJ and our grant processes, or may have been a current or prior previous grantee, typically our NOFOs are out on the street for a little bit longer. So both of these were published on May 14th, and they're going to close on June 15th. So we're only out for 30 days. And if you have not taken a look, you can find links to both of these NOFOs on grants.gov. You can also find them on nij.gov, which is our homepage, our website. There's a bar at the top, and there's a funding tab. If you go to current opportunities and scroll down, you'll find both of those, and you can download the NOFOs both as a PDF document and read through them. Both of the NOFOs are about, there's about 39 pages of content. On the table of contents of both of these, I just want to just hopefully address maybe some some questions ahead of time. You'll find some basic information about the NOFO's overall concept and the dates at the front of the NOFO. We have a section on eligibility. Typically, the eligibility to apply to our grant opportunities is pretty broad. Generally speaking, the only type of entity that cannot apply to our grants would be foreign organizations and typically individuals. Then we talk about the program description in both of those, talking about kind of this is the sort of the research questions, but that both Jill and Steve will talk about. And then we have a section on what needs to be in the application itself, what the submission requirements are, and the deadlines. I'll talk a little bit more about this kind of later in the webinar. Both of these NOFOs are a little unique for us this year. Many of the NOFOs that you'll see on NIJ's website request application or submission of a full applications, and that's how we have operated in years past. Both of these NOFOs are actually sort of a two-phase process. We start off with a concept paper, which is described in the NOFO, which is a very short document that will, I think, open up the opportunity to many folks who may not typically be NIJ applicants. And then the best of those concept papers will be invited for a full application later on in the year. We do talk about the application review process in the NOFO, what happens if you do get an award, and then some of the post-award requirements and the administration of a grant once you get a grant. There's a lot of great online resources I'll come back to and kind of point out as well as we get through the NOFO that you can read about what to do during the sort of the application process. And in addition, if you do end up becoming a grant recipient of NIJ's, sort of how to administer your grant if you're not familiar with how to do that. And then there's some other information at the end and a checklist of important things to make sure that you provide with your application. So without further ado, I am joined on this webinar by two of my team members. We are all from NIJ's Office of Technology and Standards. NIJ has 5 science offices. So my office, which I'm the office director of, we cover areas of criminal justice and law enforcement technology, performance standards for equipment, conformity assessment of protective equipment, and anything that involves sort of technology and standards within the criminal justice system. AJ, if you could move to the next slide. And I will pass it over to Jill Barnas on my team, and she can talk about the artificial intelligence NOFO.
Hi everyone, my name is Jill Barnas, and like Mark said, I'm going to walk us through the artificial intelligence NOFO. Recent changes in AI capabilities are finding their way into many products and services, including those designed for, marketed to, and used by criminal justice agencies. This program seeks to build on the prior NIJ efforts to improve the effectiveness of criminal justice processes through AI applications to enhance crime prevention, public safety, and decision making. NIJ expects to fund studies that explore and examine the suitability of using AI to solve operational problems, as well as evaluate the impacts and outcomes when integrated into criminal justice practice. AJ, if you could go to the next slide, please. So there's one goal and objective for this NOFO. The goal is to generate new knowledge that enhances the effectiveness of AI in criminal justice and addresses potential risks by supporting research that advances the understanding and application of AI in criminal justice, including projects that explore innovative uses of AI, evaluate existing systems, or develop methodologies for testing and improving AI technologies. And the objective of this NOFO is to support the development of innovative research projects that explore new applications or methodologies for AI in combating violent crime, immigration enforcement, and other law enforcement activities, including the evaluation of existing AI technologies in practice, advancing knowledge and practices in the field. And with that, I will turn it over to Steve to talk about the technology NOFO.
Next slide, AJ. Hi, I'm Steve Schutz. I'm a senior physical scientist at NIJ. and I'm going to talk about the 25 research and evaluation of emerging technology implementation and impact for law enforcement purposes. Many law enforcement agencies continue to grapple with fundamental questions of whether new technologies have led to better outcomes, what the actual returns on investments are, and whether the new capabilities have been deployed in the best manner. NIJ expects to fund research and evaluation of technology implementations to guide law enforcement community on the best ways to implement technology to solve contemporary problems in policing and understand the factors that contribute to successful technology implementations. Next slide, AJ. NIJ welcomes research and evaluation on the growing use of small unmanned aircraft systems or drones, such as drone as first responders capabilities. NIJ also welcomes research and evaluation of the use of artificial intelligence, such as the effectiveness of integrating advanced threat detection technology with existing security camera in public areas and other efforts to retrofit existing security infrastructure. Next slide, AJ. So there's one goal with two objectives in this NOFO. The goal is to create rigorous evaluations of technology implementations for law enforcement purposes and generate new knowledge that provides practical evidence to law enforcement practitioner audiences to inform policy and practices. First objective is to support the development of innovative research projects that rigorously evaluates technology implementations for law enforcement purposes. The second is to generate studies that examine technology as a solution to other operational challenges, such as recruitment, retention, and the training of sworn and non-sworn personnel or other staffing issues. And I guess I will give it back to Mark. Please advance to the next slide.
All right. Thank you, Steve and Jill. All right, so now I'm going to talk a little bit for the remainder of the webinar, more about process. So this is sort of the application process. And I think many potential applicants or those interested in our funding opportunities probably come to the table with varying degrees of understanding about sort of the grant process. One of the things you'll want to do ahead of time is register on sam.gov and to activate that registration status. We do have information in the NOFO about how to do that, what is required. If you are attending this webinar and you are from a large organization like a research university, for example, you probably have an Office of Sponsored Research or something akin to that that handles that and has probably already done that. If you're a smaller organization that has not received grants from the federal government, I would recommend reviewing that section and registering as early as you can. Go ahead and advance to the next slide, AJ. All right. So I want to talk a little bit about the application submission process. Both of these NOFOs are a little bit different than our other NOFOs. We have divided it up into two phases. The first phase is a concept paper, and the second phase is submission of a full application upon invitation. Those of you who may have applied for funding with other federal departments, for example, the Department of Defense or Department of Homeland Security, Department of Energy, some others, you may be familiar with a multi-phase application process, starting with something called a quad chart, and then a white paper, and then a full proposal. Our concept paper kind of sits in the middle between a quad chart and a white paper. What we want to do is allow, I think, a greater applicant pool to be able to access the funds available on both of these NOFOs. We've described in the NOFO an NIJ internal merit review process. We will be reviewing the concept papers internally with federal staff in accordance with a rubric we describe in the NOFO. And then the best scoring applications from that step will be invited to submit a full proposal, which will be reviewed by an external, be merit reviewed by external subject matter experts, followed by award decisions later on in the year. Go ahead and advance it to the next one, AJ. All right, so the submission of the concept paper, first step is to get into grants.gov and get in there at least 48 hours before the deadline of the NOFO. Our deadline for both of these is June 15th at 11:59 p.m. So get in a little bit earlier than both of those. I think that's a Monday. So I would probably recommend the week before at the latest in case you run into any problems. Register in grants.gov if you have not already. Confirm your roles. And then, of course, very important in the world of grants is to complete your application for federal assistance, which is a form called the SF424. That's the only real paperwork you have to complete at the concept paper stage. And you can complete those really anytime, starting right now if you haven't already. And you can also go to grants.gov. They have a quick start guide for more tips and resources on how to use grants.gov. So go ahead and advance to the next slide, AJ. All right. So we have a system that we use here at the Department of Justice called Just Grants. Applications come from grants.gov, the 424, and then applicants upload their documents to our system called Just Grants. Just Grants is a system that is used by the Office of Justice Programs, which is a big grant-making component of the Department of Justice, as well as the Community-Oriented Policing Services component, and also the Office of Violence Against Women, OVW. So these are the big grant-making components of DOJ, and we all use Just Grants. So this is where you will be able to register and then upload your concept paper package. It's pretty straightforward. It's pretty simple. There's you can upload it as one document, and I don't think we restrict it to it can either be a Word or PDF. Obviously PDF is very easy, but a Word is fine. We have a cover page with your project title and contact information, 4-page narrative describing the project. We do have some guidelines in the NOFO about that, 12-point font, double space, 1-inch margins, your typical kind of format. Then 1 page outlining the applicant's capabilities. That includes sort of a biographical sketches of the principal investigators or key personnel, institutional resources, and then a 1-page budget sketch. I've been kind of tracking the Q&A, and just to sort of address this, we've kept the the format here pretty open and a little bit agnostic. So in terms of a budget sketch, 1 page, we want you to be able to capture what you think is the important information. One thing that we typically do, or not typically do, but we always do with our grant application process is we go through a process called Basic Minimum Requirements, or BMR, and that is just to make sure that each application has all the required materials. So the narrative, the 1-page capability statement, and then 1-page budget sketch are sort of required materials. We do have the 1-page and the 4-page and the 1-page limit on the other two. If you were to submit something that went beyond those page limits, we would not reject the concept paper for that reason, but we would essentially limit it to those 1 pages. So we would stop reading after 1 page for the budget sketch and 4 pages after the narrative. So just be aware of that. We do have those. We are going to sort of adhere to those strict limits for the concept paper. Okay, go ahead, AJ, next slide. And what happens next? We're talking about that just already. After you submit your application into Just Grants, we will start our review process, starting with the basic minimum requirements, responsiveness to the NOFO. Whether you're writing a project sketch for something that is not responsive to what we're asking, so AI or technology implementation. And then we have an NIJ internal merit review process. We're going to be doing merit review with federal staff inside of the Office of Justice Programs. We kind of outline what that review process looks like. We'll be reviewing each one of the three major components: the narrative, the bio sketch, and the budget sketch, using a scoring rubric of 0 to 4. So each one of those will get a score. Each one of those categories will get a score of 0 to 4. So each application will get a score, a total score of 0 to 12. And each one will be reviewed by at least 2 staff members. Once we have reviewed all of the concept papers, the highest scoring ones will be invited for full proposal. Go ahead to the next slide. All right, now a submission for a full application. So if you do receive an invitational letter, we do specify that in the NOFO that a letter will be sent inviting you to submit a full application. That one we have a lot of information in the NOFO. This is typically like our other NOFOs. There's a lot of information you've got to provide, some standard applicant information, abstract, proposal, the narrative statement, which is up to 30 pages long, a more detailed budget and a budget worksheet, any memorandum of understanding, other supportive documents, letters of support, travel authorizing agreements, if that's applicable, and a number of other things that you need to apply: research integrity, human subjects and privacy, a lot of disclosures and assurances. So a lot of information to keep track of. We do anticipate, hopefully, depending on the number of concept papers we do receive, to be able to get invitational letters out by the middle of July. We are hoping, and then we'll have more information in those letters, but all of that is detailed in the NOFO, and I think you'll have about 30 days upon receiving an invitation to submit a full application to get that into Just Grants. You do not need to go back into grants.gov at that point. You just go right back into Just Grants and upload the full application. So unless you are invited, please do not submit a full application. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So what happens after that? Again, we'll do basic minimum requirements, and what documents are basic minimum required documents are outlined in the NOFO, but that's project narrative, budget narrative, CVs of key personnel, updated SF424, things like that. It's all specified in there. We will do merit review with our external subject matter experts. Typically that's 3 or 4 SMEs. I typically like to do 4. And because we are an applied research agency, we typically like to do sort of 2 researchers, 2 academics, and 2 practitioners. There's a programmatic and a financial review part, risk review, as a part of the review of the full applications. Go ahead to the next slide. And then award notices will be made on the OJP website. There's a section in the NOFO about that. And then funded applications notifications will be sent through Just Grants. The system sends out an email to the applicants. And if you're a university that receives grants, typically those notifications go to an authorized representative. That's getting a little bit into the weeds down the road, but that's how the notifications will be sent. You'll have 45 days to accept or decline the awards, and then there's you'll get a packet of information about that. And then there's a lot of great resources about now what, I have a grant, what do I do? We have a lot of great resources about how to manage grants, a DOJ financial guide. But again, if you're at a large organization that receives grants, you'll probably have a sponsored research office that will help you with that. All the funding decisions are made at the discretion of the NIJ director. That is in our statutory authority. That is how it's been since NIJ has been an agency. So that is NIJ director makes final decisions. AJ, go ahead, next slide. And a lot of great resources here to ask questions. We have our response center here. You can also reach out to grants.gov if you have specific issues with grants.gov. If there's an outage with grants.gov, I'm not sure that we could be of any help, so you'll have to reach out to them directly. But if you do have an issue with Just Grants, you can call us. We have a phone number and email there about Just Grants if you have technical issues with that one. If you do have questions about the NOFO itself, like what's in the NOFO, those should be directed to the OJP Response Center at the 800 number or the email. And AJ, if you want to go to the next slide. All right, and we have some great resources again about funding. Again, the DOJ Financial Guide, that's more about what you should expect when you get a grant and how to manage that. And then we have some NIJ specific FAQs about our funding. And we have a pretty good page about funding, current funding, expired funding, projects that we've funded, a lot of good information on the NIJ website. So definitely recommend you guys check that out. And AJ, I think that probably brings us to the end. All right. Well, we will start with the Q&A and see if we can get through some of the Q&A here. Okay, so question here. How detailed does the budget have to be in the concept paper stage? The first step, can it be in narrative form with general funding categories anticipated? For example, most funds will be used for personnel and travel, or does the NIJ want a rough estimate with a budget table and a brief justification? You keep it sort of open for folks to provide what they think is important, but certainly I think we would want to have kind of a rough order of magnitude and what the funds would be used for. So if you think that it's going to be, a certain amount of money and it's going to be mostly for personnel, kind of let us know that and sort of what what a staffing might look like, I would say. But we kind of keep it kind of open for you guys to tell us what you think would work for the project. And I hope that answers the question. Next question, if the proposal covers both topics, should we submit an application for both, or how do you suggest we select which to apply for? It's a great question. I think that, both of the NOFOs kind of have their own distinct research questions. So both concept papers would need to be responsive to those. I know that we are requesting or including AI into the technology implementation one. So I think that as long as you are responsive to both of those NOFOs with your application, and of course you can modify it. Certainly you could apply to both. At the end, of course, we always deconflict, and we don't want to fund a project twice. So I would not expect at the end of this process that should you be invited for a full application that you would get duplicative funding. So if they're very, very similar, you certainly could apply to both, but we have to sort of deconflict those kind of as we move forward. All right, next question. Are the AI applications you want audited machine learning based, or are they expert systems? Machine learning based applications are non-deterministic, replicating output that can sometimes be challenging. Well, we kind of keep it open to interpretation, and not want to limit any idea. So I think, again, we're an applied research agency, and very much interested in kind of research to practice, so long as it is responsive to the topic of in the NOFO. And I think that it would be, we welcome those applications, but we didn't want to be too overly descriptive in terms of what we want. This is a research NOFO. These are grants. This is not a sort of contract for services type of activity, so it's not an acquisition. So we wanted to kind of keep it open. All right, moving on. These are great questions. I appreciate it. Keep them coming. For the concept paper, how detailed does the budget need to be? Do we submit a budget table and justification or just a budget narrative for the rough estimate of the anticipated cost? Hopefully I answered that one before. I think, some discussion of what the budget, what the sort of overall level of effort, and what funds would be spent and why, and trying to capture that in one page. Do you have to submit an SF424 for each grant? Yes. All right. I'm Dr. Ellis Zornick, White House National Security, United States Director of Civil Division, and my nomination is okay. I'll have to come back to that question. I don't know if that's responsive to the NOFO, but I would have to come back to that question. What is the expected timeline for the review of concept papers prior to the issuance of invitations for proposal submission? Great question. We're hoping that by the time that phase 1 closes on June 15th, that we can have invitations out by July 15th. That is our anticipated deadline, we hope. Should we receive many concept papers, it may take us a little more time, so we'll see. Okay, for university applicants, how detailed should the concept paper budget sketch be? Should it include graduate research, assistant stipend, tuition, fringe, indirect cost, or is a higher level summary sufficient? I would say that the spirit of this is that it's probably a higher level summary. I mean, you certainly don't want to suggest you don't include information, but it's not necessarily a detailed budget that you would need to have, all the costs articulated. We understand that a fuller budget would take a little bit more time. So the idea is to just get a sense of, again, level of effort, what the funds would be used for, general cost categories, that I think is, and that it supports, that the budget itself is supportive of what you're describing in the narrative. Certainly you don't want to talk about something in the narrative and then, describe something in the budget that doesn't sort of comport. You want to make sure that those two things kind of match each other, that the level of effort is commensurate with what you're proposing in the narrative. Great question. Could NIJ clarify how the required cost benefit and cost effectiveness analyses be weighted relative to the core emerging technology implementation objectives? Because rigorous economic analyses can significantly increase project scope and cost, additional guidance on the expected level of rigor would be helpful. Great question. Not sure I have a straightforward answer for you. I think that if you are going to propose a cost benefit or cost effectiveness analysis and focus heavily on that, I think that you should describe that the budget should also describe accurately what that will cost, the budget sketch. I don't know, Steve, what are your thoughts on that question? It's a great question.
Well, on the concept, it's not broken apart. That
Right.
would come into play more in the full proposal if we've asked for that
Yeah.
applicant. And then in there, they obviously have a lot more pages to go into more detail
Right.
of what that would require.
I think that's a really good answer. I mean, I think that if you can sketch it out in the concept paper, and then if you're invited for a full application, you've got a lot more real estate to kind of, really like unpack that and kind of itemize some of the costs associated with that. It's a great question. Do you have an idea of approximately how many invitees for full submissions will be sent? That's a great question. And let me just, by answering that question, let me talk a little bit about sort of why I think we're exploring the concept paper in these two. If you look at the number of NOFOs that NIJ has out right now, how many we have, and if you're familiar with NIJ and our grants in the past, we publish 15 to 25 NOFOs a year, something like that, depending on the year. We will often have NOFOs that have maybe $2 million available, $3 million available. The reality is with a lot, or $1 million available, 1.5, the reality is that we end up having, just because of how much a research grant costs, we may fund 2 or 3 for each NOFO, and we receive 30 or 50 or 100, or in some cases 150 applications, full applications that applicants need to put together. And when you've only got enough funds to fund 2 or 3 or 4 grants, you guys can do the math. That's not great odds in terms of getting an award. So the idea is to offer the field, you guys, the potential applicants, an opportunity to submit a concept paper with sort of a smaller, less level of effort, so that we can review that and then invite, I think, a healthy number of invitations, so that we can explore sort of the best concepts, and not burden everybody with having to put together a full proposal, knowing that the odds aren't great to get a grant to begin with. So we would typically probably have maybe something like 3 times the number of applications, of 3 times the number of grants that we would offer. So that kind of gives you a sense of how many we would invite, maybe 3 to 4 times that. So that's kind of the idea. And it's also a considerable amount of effort to do full external peer review, of full applications. And if we're trying to, review dozens and dozens and dozens of full applications, that gets time consuming, it's expensive, and it can delay things. So we're trying to find this kind of happy medium in terms of process about, allowing as much accessibility, while kind of reducing the overall sort of effort at the front end. And then when we get to the full proposals, then I think, those invitees will know, hey, this is serious, and they're very interested, and this is something that we have a better shot of getting. So that's the idea. I hope that answers that question. Once registered in SAM, do we register with grants.gov, or only after concept papers has been submitted, an invitation for full response has been received? So register in SAM, like first, early and often. Register with grants.gov before the concept paper. Hopefully that information is, we'll have this webinar information online afterwards at some point shortly, but it's also in the NOFO. You'll be going through grants.gov to submit your concept paper in Just Grants. So make sure you register in both ahead of time. Okay, good question. What distinguishes a strong concept paper from a merely eligible one? What do reviewers weigh most heavily? Well, it's a great question. And I don't know that there's an easy answer to that. We have the content in the programmatic program-specific content in the NOFO. Again, we're an applied research agency, and our goal is to conduct and fund research and evaluation to support the criminal justice system and its functioning. So I think that it's up to the submitters to make the strong case that this is an important thing. This is an important concept to explore. This is needed, and why. So I think in some ways it's up to the applicant community to put together a strong concept and convince us, I think. Are the subjects, okay, next question. Are the subjects in which we propose audits of open-ended? For instance, can I suggest an audit of your systems for tracking crypto finances? Current solution is inadequate. I'm not really sure that I know what you mean by open-ended. I guess I could interpret that as we have a very sort of, we're not drilling down, I think, super specifically. I mean, I think we've highlighted a couple of things we're interested in, but those are just, for examples. I think if you have a compelling argument, if you have a topic that is compelling, that has a criminal justice nexus and is very important, and you can describe why, I think that, submit a concept paper and let's see what happens. I hope that answers the question.
Mm-hmm.
I like all the questions. As the questions come in, it kind of pushes my window a little bit, so just give me a moment. What is the maximum time frame for the project? That's a great question. Jill answered that question. Yep, we typically have a 5-year period of performance overall. We usually start with a shorter period of performance, but we can go out to 5 years. If applying with a local state implementation site partner, would you encourage they apply for the BJA awards as well for implementation or personnel staffing? I can't really answer that question. I certainly would encourage anybody to apply for any grants that they feel that they would make sense for their organization. I think that if the implication is that they should apply for a BJA grant, and that would be a part of the NIJ project, I think, that would be something that you could explore, but, if there's a lot of contingencies, like if I do this, then this happens. So I can't really answer that question adequately. I would say just, you'd have to, put together a strong concept paper, and we'll see where it goes. Is there a cap on indirect costs in the budget? That's a good question. Indirect costs are addressed for a grant organization. And I am just going to, don't hold me to this. The DOJ financial guide talks about indirect cost rates. So if you're talking about sort of finalizing a budget on a grant, that's a really great resource to go check. I will tell you, just generally speaking, universities, research organizations will have a federally negotiated indirect cost rate agreement that is recognized by all grant making organizations or other departments. If you're applying for a contract or something like that, that's typically recognized, and you'll have a cognizant agency does that. Sometimes it's Department of Energy, sometimes it's Department of Homeland Security, DoD, and that will have a indirect cost rate that is kind of set in stone, so to speak. I think in the grant regulations, if you don't have that, you can use a de minimis rate, which is like 10%. But that's again specified in the DOJ financial guide, and also articulated in 2 CFR 200. We call that part 200. That's the grant making regulations. So I think you can either have an indirect cost rate agreement or use a de minimis. And if neither of those work out, our financial team, you can ask questions of them as well. But I would check the DOJ financial guide for clear guidance on indirect cost rate agreements. All right, we are a police department and we would like to partner with the university as a researcher. We're looking into a regional DFR. We permitted to purchase DFR components. Yes, those are eligible things to do. In fact, one of the things that we are encouraging is if you're going to do a technology implementation, and I assume the question is for the technology implementation, is that we would like, we very much welcome concept papers that take technology and ultimately get them into the hands of the practitioner agencies. at the end of the project. So implement an evaluation, implement, evaluate, and then transition. Are there any examples of previous concepts online, more for clarification of how detailed the information should be or to remain within the page restrictions? Unfortunately, there aren't. The NIJ used to do concept papers a long time ago. I think, Steve, it's been
20 years.
20 years. So I would say we don't really have a good example of that online. We're sort of trying this out again trying it again for the first time after many years. So unfortunately, I don't, but we do keep it kind of open and agnostic so that, you guys can be creative. What is the anticipated budget range for funded research projects? That's a great question. We do have some language in the NOFO about that. We do have a cap on the total amount and the total awards. We do not have necessarily like we are looking for this specific amount. I think we want to have projects and budgets that are congruent with another one. So what does that mean? I mean, if you have something small that's like $250K that you're like, this would be great, we can just knock this out in a year, I mean, we welcome that. If you're like, I want the whole enchilada and I want multi-site, all this, to do a bunch of things, there's nothing that prohibits you from trying both. So we're keeping it as open as possible. So I don't want to narrow this to like, well, our average grant award is, our median award is like, we're just like, we want projects and budgets that are commensurate with each other. How many proposals do you anticipate being funded? Like I said, typically with any NOFO, you guys can even, you can confirm this on our website. If you go look at expired funding and past NOFOs, we'll see, grants that have been funded, we'll typically fund 2 or 3 or 4 per NOFO. So you guys can get a sense of what we've funded, how much they are, not to say that that's exactly how it goes. Your mileage may vary going forward, but it can give you at least a sense. All right. We're making good progress and the questions are great. Next question, the research period is 60 months. Does the budget sketch include a year-over-year budget? Is the 2.5 million budget for all 5 years, i.e. 500 per year total? So that's a great question. Yeah. I'd say if you in the budget sketch, you want to, propose, well, it'll take me 3 years to do this, or it'll take 4 years or 5 years. Talking about how much per year and what that's, what the money goes towards, I think would be welcome to see that to the best of your ability to kind of sketch that out. But that total amount is sort of the total amount, so we would not, although on some occasions we do supplement grants, we would not expect to be supplementing funds on any of these. These would be like, this is my grant proposal. I propose X amount of dollars and it's going to take 3.5 years to do it. Tell us why. And that's what it would be. Why have 2 NOFOs? What is the biggest distinction between the two? Well, the one is very much focused on artificial intelligence. The other one is more broadly technology implementation for new and emerging technologies in the criminal justice and law enforcement areas. So those are the 2 distinctions. Okay, next question. In our concept paper, can we propose alternative solutions to problem sets, such as a custom solution or alternative technology, or is this limited to purely to an audit? I don't think it's limited purely to an audit. I think that you could propose something. I think that the difference here, just to give a little bit of guidance, is this is a grant. We anticipate awarding through grants and not a contract. So this would not, there should not be any expectation that NIJ will take a solution and that the NIJ at the end of the day will be sort of like an app store and be like a delivery mechanism for something. So I think if you wanted to propose a custom solution or alternative technology, working with a law enforcement agency, I think an important part of that would be sort of explaining, what happens once the grant is over, talk about the durability of that solution. I think would be, probably in order. You think, Steve? I mean, that kind of.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sounds like with both practitioners and researchers on the expert panel, would you say that the proposal should be written for a broader audience understanding non-technical?
Practitioners are very technical.
No, I mean, the practitioners that we get are experts. These are people that have been doing this for years. Some of them are very
academics.
Yeah, like Steve mentioned, I mean, many of them are pracademics because somewhere they straddle the world of practice and academia. Many have PhDs of their own, so I don't think that you should pull punches at all. I think what is important is to explain what you're trying to do, why it's important, and do that clearly, technical or not. And I think that's the most important thing. But I would say, you can be as technical as you want. Just don't be so technical that nobody knows what you're talking about. Are there any technological innovations, AI uses that funders are not interested in funding? Best I can say is that, what we have in the NOFO is the best guidance you're gonna get on that. Again, we're an applied agency. We're interested in sort of research to practice. So make sure that the concept papers you submit kind of support that kind of mission. At the end of the day, we really want to see solutions, that are useful for the criminal justice and law enforcement community, and that can be fielded. So that's really, so I think, making sure that things have an interest, or not interest, that are they're relevant to sort of policy and practice in the U.S. We are a police department, and we would like to.
Same question.
Oh, same question. Yep. Which is in addition to the researcher. Are we permitted to purchase the DFR components in addition to the researcher? Yeah, I think if you, the best I can interpret that question is, technology purchases are permitted. We do like to see technology transitioned into the field. And if you mean permitted to purchase the DFR components in addition to the researcher using a potential grant funds, I think you guys would just you'd have to just explain that to us. But I don't see anything in that question that would say there would be any prohibition on that. To clarify, can we go with our NICRA, assuming we have one? Is that correct? Give me 1 second on that question. Yeah, I mean, that would be something that would be recognized. I mean, that would be your indirect cost rate agreement. If you're trying to suggest how much indirect cost would be associated. Yeah, I think your NICRA would be fine. Ah, geez, questions just jumped up.
Yeah, they jumped.
Okay. Question. How can a graduate in criminology and criminal justice position themselves to contribute effectively to NIJ related research, forensic, or investigative projects? Well, I think read the NOFOs and see if there's any that you think you would be you would have an idea to respond to. I think that was a pretty general question, so I think you just have to look at our NOFOs and see if there's something you're interested in submitting an application to. What are some common reasons why concept papers are rejected? Well, this is a sort of a concept paper pilot, both of these. I think that the concept papers would be rejected for the reasons that full proposals are rejected, for the same exact reasons. Maybe not a strong argument, maybe not communicated well, no relevance to the field, perhaps, an idea that has already been explored and proven not useful. And oftentimes perhaps, just I think sort of we want strong arguments, strong convincing arguments to be presented to us. So I don't think there's anything special about the concept paper. I think it's all the same idea as the full proposal, just shorter format. Could NIJ clarify whether equipment and technology purchases are allowable under the solicitation? And if so, whether there are any limitations or caps on equipment-related costs within the proposed budget? It's a great question, and I'll tell you why it's a great question. No, there's not equipment and technology purchases are allowable under the solicitation. However, those of you who may pay attention to both NIJ solicitations or NOFOs and BJA NOFOs, is we are a research agency. And so for a technology implementation NOFO, for example, we would expect there to be very serious and rigorous sort of evaluation, like a technology implementation plan and a rigorous evaluation in addition to the technology purchases, as opposed to a BJA project where that may be just like they're providing funds to purchase equipment, and there may not be much in the order of an evaluation, perhaps a brief evaluation of, does it work well or something like that, but nothing rigorous. So I would say that's a balance. You're going to have to balance the technology purchase with the ability to evaluate that technology in practice. Hopefully that answered the question. All right, so what opportunities, skills, certification, and professional bit will gain from attending this project? I'm gonna have to come back to that one. I'm not sure that's not sure I can answer those questions in the context of the NOFOs. Okay, next one, checking understanding. If we have a single site and a more ambitious multi-site with slightly different objectives, we could consider submitting both. I think if both are responsive to the NOFO, then yes, we would not reject any, I would not recommend, we would not ever discourage anyone from submitting more than one NOFO, more than one concept paper. More than one concept paper can be submitted, so long as they are distinct and different. Could you reiterate the NIJ internal merit review again? You mentioned something like a total of zero. Oh, right. Okay. So each of the three components of the narrative, the budget sketch and the bio sketch will be scored. Each one will be scored on a scale from 0 to 4. And then the sum of that will give you the total score for that application. So you will get score of 0 to 4 for narrative, 0 to 4 for budget sketch, 0 to 4 for bio sketch or capabilities. We call it the bio sketch, but capabilities and competencies. So you would have a total overall score of 0 to 12, and then we'll have at least two reviews per concept paper. So your overall score would be summing those. Those categories will not be weighted; they'll just be 0 to 4 for each. Would AI, as it relates to radio frequencies and/or signals intelligence, be applicable? Well, I'm not going to say it's not applicable, but you should explain in your concept paper why it is and why it's important. So any concept, so long as it's responsive to the NOFO, I'm going to say is fair game, but you'll have to explain why it is, why it's important, and why we should fund it. Okay, question. All right. What level of detail in AI architecture would be recommended? Well, I'm not sure I can fully answer that question. Like I said, I think maybe for the above one, if it's germane and relevant to the argument, I will leave it to you to describe the level of detail of AI architecture that you think is important. To convince us that it's a relevant problem to the field and that it's worthy of funding. Last question. We're coming up on time, folks. You're doing great with your questions. And I get to this last couple here. Could a university submit a proposal to work with data from a police department that DOJ considers not in compliance with 8 U.S.C. 1373 if there is no pass-through funding to that police department? I would probably need to defer an answer to that question because I'm not sure of the answer to that. That's a very specific question. I appreciate the question. I don't want to give you an incorrect answer. I don't.
Doing good.
Doing good. Hang on one second. I'll make just a quick. Let me make an attempt to try to see if I can give
Standard ratio now.
prohibits from education.
I think there's something in the NOFOs about it.
Oh, is there?
Yeah,
Mhm.
I think it's spelled out in the NOFOs.
Okay. Let me appreciate the question. If you guys can just hang with me for one more second. Yes. So in the NOFO that is addressed. So we talk about in section, the program description, you'll see a section called unallowable uses of funds. This is addressing that last question. So it says the following are certain unallowable costs and certain activities that are out of program scope and will not be funded. So one of those is out of program scope is any program or activity at any tier that directly or indirectly violates or promotes or facilitates the violation of federal immigration law, including 8 U.S.C. 17, Section 1373, or impedes or hinders the enforcement of federal immigration law, including by failing to comply with 8 U.S.C. Section 1373, give access to DHS agents or honor DHS requests and provide requested notice to DHS agents. Here is what I would recommend if you, to the requester, to the question asker, send your question to the ojp.response center email. It's in the NOFO. That will get routed to us and we can address that question. I do not want to give you incorrect information about that though, but it is at least addressed in the NOFO to some extent, and hopefully we'll find you a more specific answer to your question. So send that to the OJP Response Center, please. I think we have come to the end of our questions.
Yeah.
I really appreciate everybody attending today. Hopefully you have gotten something out of it. I'm hopeful that we have been able to answer your questions quickly on the fly to give you some guidance and some insights as to sort of what we're looking for, what the process will, the review process will look like. And certainly we encourage everybody, if you're interested, to apply. We've tried to make this with the concept papers as easy as possible for everybody to submit ideas to us. Let us know. And we appreciate everybody's interest and look forward to reviewing some really great concepts. So with that, we really thank you for your time and your attention. And AJ, I'm going to hand it back over to you. Close us out.
All right. Thank you all for joining today's webinar. This concludes the session. Everybody have a great day.